At the meeting where I was supposed to save my father's legacy, my ex and her new husband kicked the door open like they owned the place. "We want half of your $500 million company," she said, smiling like she hadn't blown my life apart once already. I looked her in the eye and told her the truth. "You're not getting anything." The next morning, they called me laughing. "We burned your company down," they said, as if destroying the last thing my father left me was a joke. I drove there shaking, thinking everything he built had turned to ash. But when I arrived, I laughed. Because the building they torched wasn't mine. Not anymore. My name is Atlas Rowan, and this is the story of how the people who tried to ruin me ended up destroying themselves instead. Before I share my story, I'd love to know you are here with me and listening. Comment hi below, or tell me where you're from. I love hearing how far my story reach. Sometimes knowing someone is there makes all the difference. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. And before we dive in, if you'd like to follow my journey as I rebuild my life, piece by piece, feel free to subscribe. It truly helps more than you know. I was standing at the head of the long glass conference table in our San Francisco headquarters, trying to steady the ship that had been mine for barely 3 months. Rowan Dynamics had been my father's empire, but after his sudden death, it had become my responsibility whether I was ready or not. The directors watched me closely as I walked them through the restructuring plan, and even though the room was tense, even though I was exhausted in ways I didn't say out loud, I still felt in control, at least for the moment. Then the doors slammed open so hard the glass rattled. Celine Ward, my ex, walked in first heels, hitting the polished floor like she was entering a stage. Behind her was her new husband, Jace Holloway, wearing a smug grin that made the board members shift uneasily. Their appearance was so abrupt, so out of place, that for a full second no one breathed. I felt my stomach twist. Of all places, of all moments, this was where they chose to confront me. Celine marched straight to the table and threw a folder down in front of me, the papers inside fanning out like an accusation. "We're here for what's ours," she announced, her voice slicing through the room. "Half of Rowan Dynamics. Half of your $500 million company." Grant promised it. She said my father's name with a familiarity that made my jaw tighten. I kept my voice cold, steady. "You're not getting anything." Jace stepped forward, his expression shifting from smug to condescending. "Your father made assurances," he said. "Real assurances. Maybe he didn't tell you everything." His words hit harder than I wanted to admit. My father had despised lies, but had he ever trusted Celine? Had he ever considered giving her anything? The doubt struck deep enough that it made me blink. Celine caught that flicker and smiled like she'd just won something. She turned to leave, but not before tossing one final sentence over her shoulder. "By tomorrow, Atlas, you won't have anything left to keep." Her heels clicked down the hallway as if she were counting down the seconds to my downfall. The room stayed silent long after they left. Directors avoided my eyes. I tried to return to the agenda, but every word blurred. When the meeting finally adjourned, I walked out into the foggy San Francisco afternoon with a weight pressing against my ribs. All I could think was, what made her so certain? What did she think she knew that I didn't? And why did it feel like my father had left me more than a company, like he had left me a warning I still hadn't found? That question followed me all the way home. Driving back along the coast to Santa Cruz that evening felt different. The ocean usually grounded me, but that night it only reminded me of how empty the world felt without my father in it. When I pulled into the driveway of the old Rowan estate, the silence wrapped around me like a memory. The house still smelled faintly of his cologne. The greenhouse behind it still looked exactly the same as the last day he walked into it, humid, warm, glowing beneath strings of soft lights he'd hung himself. I went there because I needed to feel close to him. I didn't expect to find anything. But as I stepped between the orchids and the rows of rare plants he'd nurtured for decades, my eye caught something tucked beneath a ceramic pot, a yellowed envelope with my name written in his looping handwriting. "Atlas open when the wolves start circling." My breath snagged in my chest. He'd used that metaphor my entire childhood to describe people who only smiled when they wanted something. and Selene had always fit that description too well. Inside the envelope was a small brass key and a letter. My father's voice played in my mind as I read. He warned that someone would try to destroy the company after his death. He told me to open the safe in his office. And then came the part that made my hands shake. Do not trust anyone. Not even Ember, my brother. The last person I thought my father would ever caution me against. The confusion cut deeper than the warning itself. Ember and I had fought before, sure, but betrayal. It didn't make sense, unless there was something I didn't know. I went to my father's study, unlocked the safe, and found a collection of things that chilled me. An SSD loaded with files, a USB drive, photographs of Selene and Jace meeting people they had no reason to meet, bank transfers dated during the months my father was sick, a video of Selene handing an envelope to the nurse who cared for my father in his last weeks, a forged contract with my brother's signature on it, and then one photo that froze my breath entirely. Ember standing with Selene outside a cafe, passing her a folder I recognized from my father's business archives. The floor seemed to tilt under me. Had Ember been conspiring with her? Was he part of whatever Selene had threatened me with today? I stared at all the evidence spread across my father's desk, feeling as though he had built a maze for me to walk through long after he was gone. He had prepared for everything except telling me the full truth while he was alive. As I stood there surrounded by secrets and shadows, one realization sank in: whatever was coming, I wasn't just fighting Selene. I was stepping into a battle my father had started years before, and he hadn't trusted me enough to warn me outright. And now the wolves were here, and I had no idea which direction they were coming from. It was a little after 3 in the morning when my phone lit up beside the bed. I grabbed it half awake, expecting an email from an overseas partner or some late-night alert from the security team. Instead, Selene's name glowed across the screen, followed by a message so gleeful it chilled me before I even finished reading it. We burned your company down. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. My entire body locked in place as if the words themselves had slammed into me. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud and frantic, as though my chest were struggling to hold everything inside. All I could picture was my father's life work swallowed in flames, everything he built turning into ash because of someone I once trusted. I didn't change clothes. I didn't think. I just grabbed my keys and tore out of the driveway, heading north on Highway 1 toward Monterey, where the company's old facility used to stand. The darkness outside felt heavier than usual, the road lit only by the sweep of my headlights. As I drove, my father's voice from the letter echoed in my head, his warning that someone would try to destroy what he left behind. Suddenly, every piece began stitching itself together: Selene barging into the meeting, her threat that I wouldn't have anything left by morning, the photograph of Ember with her. It all felt too orchestrated to be coincidence. The closer I got to Monterey, the more orange light I saw bleeding into the sky. And when I finally turned onto the industrial road where the old warehouse stood, my fears crystallized into a sight I'll never forget. Flames towered into the air like they wanted to take the stars down with them. The fire department was already there, water blasting against what remained of the structure, steam hissing as metal bent and collapsed. I stepped out of my car and just stood there, feeling heat on my face, watching a place I once walked through with my father dissolve into nothing. Memories flooded me, my dad leaning over prototype stations, laughing with engineers, calling me to see some new breakthrough. This had been the birthplace of Rowan Dynamics, the place where our first energy cells were built. And now it was a blackened skeleton barely holding up against the spray of the hoses. But then something tugged at the back of my mind, something off. A detail I couldn't ignore. The sign that once carried the Rowan Dynamics logo was gone, replaced almost 2 years ago when my father quietly sold the building. The layout wasn't the same either. This wasn't the facility I'd been using since becoming CEO. It wasn't even owned by the company. It was the empty warehouse my father had divested long before he died. I felt a strange mix of disbelief and something dangerously close to relief. They hadn't burned down my company. They had burned down someone else's property entirely. Right then, my phone buzzed again. A video from Selene. I tapped play. She and Jace stood in front of the roaring fire, smug, triumphant, so sure they had destroyed me. "You won't rise from this," she shouted over the flames. "This is the end for you, Atlas." Her smile was vicious, and for a split second, I wondered how someone could fall so far from who she used to be. But all I saw in that recording was evidence. Clear, undeniable, and voluntarily filmed. My father's words came back again, almost too perfectly timed. "Don't trust what they do at the surface. They're more foolish than you think." He had known something like this might happen. He had prepared me for it without telling me directly. Standing there watching firefighters put out the last stubborn flames, I realized this wasn't just an attack. It was a mistake that would cost them everything, a missing piece of the puzzle my father had started leaving for me long before he died. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the shift. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I finally had something solid in my hands, something that would turn the entire situation on its head. This fire meant to destroy me had instead revealed exactly how I could fight back. I left Monterey knowing one thing with absolute clarity. My father had set the board long ago, and now I could finally see the next move. By the time I drove back to Santa Cruz, dawn was beginning to skim the edges of the sky with gray light. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind was spinning with too many questions, too many warnings my father had left behind. I spread everything out in the greenhouse, the photos, the drives, the documents, as if arranging them might force the truth to show itself. But instead of clarity, I felt a pressure building in my chest, the kind that comes from knowing the storm hasn't even peaked yet. I didn't hear Ember come in. Only when he stepped fully into the greenhouse, the door clicking shut behind him, did I look up. He carried the fatigue of someone who'd been driving through the night, and still the first thing I felt was a flash of suspicion. That single photograph of him with Celine had rooted itself in my thoughts, blooming into doubt I didn't want to acknowledge. I slid the photo across the workbench toward him. "Explain this." For a moment, he didn't move. Then he sank into the chair opposite me and picked up the picture. I watched his expression shift, not startled, not guilty, but resigned, as though he'd been waiting for this confrontation. He admitted he had met with Celine more than once during our father's final months, and the words punched something loose in me. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to accuse him outright, but I swallowed both impulses, forcing myself to listen. He told me he hadn't been working with her. He had been playing along to gather information. Our father had suspected Celine was trying to manipulate the internal structure of the company, especially after she began spending more time around him under the guise of offering emotional support. My father knew she had ulterior motives. Ember had been sent in to confirm them. He was the one asked to be the bait. Hearing that my father had trusted Ember with such a critical task but left me in the dark left a sour ache under my ribs. I felt like I'd been shut out of my own family's war. "Why didn't he tell me?" was all I managed to say. Ember hesitated before answering. He said our father had wanted to protect me from acting impulsively, from letting my history with Celine cloud my judgment. He didn't want me pulled into something that required deception, surveillance, and manipulation. He didn't want me becoming the version of myself I had once been when things fell apart with her. It hurt more than I expected to hear that. To think my father saw me as someone who needed shielding, someone whose emotions could jeopardize an entire operation. But Ember wasn't finished. He reached into his backpack and took out a small USB drive. "This is from Dad," he said. "He asked me to hold on to it." I plugged it into my laptop, and my father's voice filled the greenhouse. Hearing him again, steady, pragmatic, painfully aware of the limited time he had left, made my throat tighten. He spoke directly to Ember, saying he knew I would misinterpret the meetings, that I would see betrayal where there was none. He asked Ember to endure it, to stay silent until everything was ready. My father sounded tired, but his clarity was unmistakable. I leaned back, eyes burning, feeling guilt settle heavy inside me. Then came another recording. Celine's voice. She was speaking harshly, pressuring a doctor to revise notes about my father's mental state near the end. She wanted documentation to later claim he had not been of sound mind while adjusting his will. Hearing her push that narrative, hearing her use my father's illness as leverage, knocked the breath out of me. This wasn't just greed anymore. It was an assault on his dignity. I shut the laptop not because I didn't want to hear more, but because the weight of what I had learned was almost too much to sit with. Celine hadn't just plotted to take the company. She had tried to rewrite the final chapter of my father's life to suit her agenda. That realization hardened something inside me. I looked at Ember and said, "We're ending this at the will reading." He nodded. The distance that had grown between us over months dissolved in that moment. We were no longer two brothers circling around secrets. We were standing on the same side at last. And for the first time since my father died, I felt ready not just to defend what he left me, but to expose everything he fought to keep hidden until the right moment arrived. By the time I pulled into the parking structure of our real headquarters in Silicon Valley, the entire building felt on edge. Word about the fire in Monterey had already spread online, and employees whispered in worried clusters in the lobby, turning toward me as if I carried the verdict in my hands. I told them the truth in a steady voice. The company remained untouched, operations were secure, and they had nothing to fear. I could see the relief move across their faces, but beneath it lay something heavier: anger that someone had tried to bring us down at all. I went straight to the security division and asked them to pull every available angle of footage from the area around the old warehouse. Within an hour, they had a cluster of screens lit up, and I stood there watching Celine and Jace parade around the fire. They started posing for the camera, as if it were some sort of victory monument. They filmed themselves laughing, shouting my name, proclaiming that I had finally lost. It was so absurd that part of me couldn't believe the two of them had sunk this low. But then something else caught my eye. In the far left corner of one frame, partly obscured by the flames, a man stood back in the shadows. He didn't move with panic or thrill. He stood like someone assessing damage, someone waiting. His posture was familiar in a way that made my skin tighten. I leaned closer to the monitor. The footage was grainy, but I knew I'd seen that silhouette before. A former employee of Rowan Dynamics, fired years ago for siphoning resources, someone my father had warned me about even before he fell ill. The realization lodged itself in my mind like a stone. The more I watched, the clearer it became that Celine and Jace weren't just acting on their own impulses. Someone had guided them, someone had fed their ambition, and someone had used them as a distraction. When I returned to my office, I took out the files my father had hidden in the safe and started piecing things together. Among the papers was a folder detailing a property acquisition. I had never heard him talk about. A second headquarters, purchased quietly, fully secured, and transferred under a separate corporate entity. That was the building I now stood in. He had moved the entire operational core long before he died. He had anticipated risks I had never imagined, and had positioned Rowan Dynamics in a way that would withstand attacks from outside and within. He hadn't told me because he wanted the transition of leadership to look clean, and because he needed to know exactly who might try to undermine me once he was gone. It was protection disguised as secrecy, a silent shield he'd built without asking for credit. Back in the pile of documents was something else I'd overlooked: a string of email archives showing Celine's communication with a tech competitor in San Jose. They had discussed a buyout plan disguised as a rescue package, one that would go into motion only if the company faced legal turmoil or public collapse. They had been preparing to swoop in the moment Rowan Dynamics became vulnerable. My stomach tightened as I read further. One file showed that my father had entertained an offer from that competitor months before his death, but only to expose their intentions. He had played the game long enough to draw them into showing their hand. Celine must have learned about those negotiations and assumed she could leverage them for her own benefit. She must have believed she could step into my father's role by destabilizing everything he had built. And then there was Ember's final recording. He played it for me that afternoon. Celine had cornered him during our father's last weeks, insisting he sign a document stating that our father had been mentally unfit while revising his will. Ember had refused, and when she pushed harder, he recorded the entire exchange. He had turned the files over to our father, who added them to the growing evidence of betrayal. The more pieces fell into place, the more I realized that this wasn't a simple power grab. Someone with influence behind the scenes had orchestrated the push against me. Celine was only the face of the problem. The real danger was the person hidden in that video, the person who knew how to operate from the shadows. By nightfall, Ember and I sat across from each other with every file, every recording, and every photograph spread across the table between us. We both understood what had to happen next. If Celine walked into the will reading expecting victory, she would walk into something very different instead. This was no longer about defending the company. It was about defending our father's name. And for the first time since his death, I felt aligned with the path he had laid out long before I understood it. We were going to bring everything into the light. When Ember asked if I was ready, I said yes, not because I wasn't afraid, but because fear had finally stopped holding me back. Tomorrow we would return everything Celine had done back to her hands, and the world would see exactly who had tried to rewrite my father's legacy. The morning of the will reading was cold, the kind of coastal chill that seeped through stone and lingered on the skin. The building my father had chosen for these private affairs was perched on a cliff in Carmel Highlands overlooking the restless ocean. As I made my way down the long hallway toward the chamber where the reading would be held, the sound of waves slamming into the rocks below echoed through the stone walls. It felt like walking into the heart of a storm. Inside, the heavy wooden table had been set with files prepared by our attorney, Marlo Vega. She greeted me with a firm nod, but there was tension in her jaw. She knew what was coming. Ember stood on my left, silent but steady, and for a brief second I felt the weight of my father's absence like a hand pressing down on my shoulder. Then the doors opened again, this time with performance. Celine swept in wearing a dress that shimmered under the overhead lights as though she believed she was arriving at an award ceremony. Behind her came a cameraman, then another, followed by a woman holding a microphone. Jace strutted beside her, adjusting his suit jacket like he'd practiced the gesture in a mirror. They had brought a media crew to capture their moment of triumph. Celine announced to the room that she had come to reclaim what she believed was hers. Her voice was bright, confident, too rehearsed. The way she smiled at the cameras told me she had no idea what she was walking into. She must have convinced herself that victory was inevitable. Before the reading began, she stepped forward and handed Marlo a sealed envelope. Inside was a supposed copy of my father's will, one she claimed granted her 30% of Rowan Dynamics. Marlo opened it, scanned the text, and immediately saw the inconsistencies. The formatting was wrong, the notarization date falsified, and my father's signature was a poorly made imitation. She set the envelope aside without a word, and Celine's confident smile faltered for the first time. Jace jumped in, threatening a lawsuit, accusing me of withholding assets that belonged to Celine. He spoke loudly, clearly for the benefit of the cameras, but every word only reinforced how little they understood the situation. I said nothing. I waited. Letting them talk was part of the plan. When the reading officially began, Marlo turned on the monitor at the head of the room. The first video played. The flames from the Monterey warehouse crackled across the screen, and there stood Celine and Jace, celebrating, calling my name like a taunt. Their faces were unmistakable, their voices loud and proud. The room went silent, even the camera crew lowering their equipment, unsure of what they were witnessing. Celine's expression collapsed. Jace took a step back, as if physical distance could erase what was already recorded. Before either of them could speak, two officers entered the room. They had a warrant tied to property destruction because the warehouse had been sold years prior and was no longer owned by Rowan Dynamics. The look on Celine's face when she realized she had destroyed a stranger's building, not mine, was something I won't forget. She tried to walk out, but the next video stopped her. My father appeared on screen, older and tired, but still sharp. He explained that if the room was seeing his message, then someone had tried to interfere with his will. He confirmed that he had been entirely sound of mind while drafting it, and that he had taken precautions to ensure any attempt to forge or manipulate his final wishes would be exposed. Around the table, no one breathed. Celine crumbled. Jace turned on her, instantly claiming she had forced him into everything, that he hadn't known what she planned. But Ember stepped forward and played the recording of Jace discussing their arrangement in explicit detail. The collapse of their alliance was complete. They had nothing left to stand on except their own lies. When the officers led them away, the room was so quiet I could hear the waves outside again. Reporters whispered. Marlowe closed the final folder. Ember put a hand on my shoulder. The chaos had ended, but the battle wasn't finished. There was still the figure in the shadow from the warehouse footage. The man who hadn't revealed himself yet. The one my father had investigated long before I realized he was a threat. As I stepped out onto the cliffside walkway, the wind carried the scent of salt water and rain. I understood that today had changed everything, but it hadn't closed the book. It had only turned the page toward whatever came next. Driving back to Santa Cruz after the chaos at Carmel Highlands felt like trying to hold myself together with shaking hands. The ocean was dark and endless, a reflection of how the night sat in my chest. Celine and Jace had been exposed, but the shadowy figure from the warehouse footage refused to leave my mind. I kept replaying the shape of his shoulders, the way he watched the fire from a distance, detached and calculating. It felt as if someone else had been steering everything long before Celine ever stepped into the picture. A few hours later, my security team sent me an encrypted file labeled with urgency. Inside was a digital enhancement of the Monterey footage. They had cleaned the image frame by frame until the silhouette resolved into a face I wish I had never seen again, Marshall Crane. He had once been our director of operations, fired by my father for siphoning funds into shell accounts. He'd vanished afterward, leaving behind lawsuits, unpaid debts, and a reputation twisted by scam after scam across several states. My father had always believed Marshall would come back to settle a score. I never understood the depth of that warning until now. I opened the spreadsheet from the safe again, scanning for anything connecting the two of them. Then I found it a series of emails from an unregistered address. One message contained an IP log that matched an apartment Marshall once rented in San Jose. The timestamp placed him working with Celine months before she'd even resurfaced in my life. The implication hit hard. She hadn't masterminded anything. She'd been recruited. Ember found me in the office, staring at the screen. He sat across from me, letting the silence stretch before he finally revealed something my father had apparently trusted him with. After Marshall's termination, my father had asked Ember to keep eyes on him, suspecting he'd been leaking early-stage tech to outside buyers. Ember had tracked his movements, his communications, and eventually uncovered that Marshall had aligned himself with people interested in dismantling Rowan Dynamics from the inside. This was long before Celine entered the equation. Hearing that turned everything upside down. Celine wasn't the architect, she was a tool. Marshall had seen her, understood the leverage she could offer, and used her resentment toward me as a doorway. His goal had never been financial settlement. He wanted destruction. He wanted my father's legacy in ruins. A sudden call came from the sheriff's office. Marshall had slipped out of the state only hours after Celine's arrest. They believed he was running a larger operation, one prepared for years. The dread that moved through me then wasn't fear. It was recognition this man had always been waiting for the right moment. The next morning, Celine requested to speak to me from the holding facility. Marlowe and Ember joined me, expecting manipulation or dramatics. Instead, we walked in to find her collapsed at a metal table, mascara, streaked hands trembling. Gone was the polished facade she'd worn so proudly. She confessed everything. She admitted Marshall had threatened her, old videos, recorded conversations, private footage he promised would go public if she didn't follow his plan. She said he even coached her on how to approach my father during his final months. Then she said something that stopped my breath entirely. Marshall had known about the will before it was rewritten. He'd been tracking internal communications and hoped to seize proof that could discredit my father posthumously. Celine had been nothing more than his access point. When I returned home, I dug deeper into the SSD my father left. In a hidden folder I hadn't found before was a final video recorded during his last week. My father looked exhausted, but unwavering. He explained how he discovered Marshall selling proprietary designs to overseas vendors, how he had traced the money back to accounts Marshall kept under false names, and how he had started laying traps long before illness slowed him down. He predicted that after his death, Marshall would strike. He knew the only way to protect the company was to ensure the truth would surface at the right moment. Hearing him speak with such clarity, knowing he planned all of this while fighting for his life, it broke something in me and rebuilt something else entirely. With everything compiled, audio footage, emails, the complete investigative trail, I sent copies to the state investigators and federal authorities. Celine realized then that she had been disposable to Marshall from the start. Whatever fight she thought she had left drained out of her. Marshall, however, became the target of a nationwide alert. For the first time in weeks, I felt the board of the puzzle settle into place. My father had seen farther than any of us, and now all that was left was to carry his work across the finish line. The morning of the press conference rose bright and cold, the kind of Silicon Valley day where the sky was so clear it almost dared you to speak the truth out loud. Standing on the rooftop terrace of our new headquarters, I looked down at the employees gathering in the atrium below, people who had grown with my father's vision, people who had shown up every day, even when the rumors threatened to overwhelm them. My father had taught me to face storms head-on, and today I finally understood why. When I stepped up to the podium, cameras clicked and lights flashed. I told them everything. I showed the footage of Celine and Jace burning the wrong building. I played the recording of Celine bribing the nurse. I presented the emails linking her to the competitor. Then I revealed the investigation into Marshall Crane, how he orchestrated sabotage long before my father's death. And finally, I played my father's last video, his voice unwavering as he explained the steps he had taken to protect both the company and the truth. The room absorbed every word. All doubt evaporated. My father's name emerged spotless. My company stood stronger than before. Just as I finished speaking, an agent approached the stage and handed Marlo a slip of paper. She read it, nodded, and whispered to me. Marshall had been arrested at a border checkpoint while attempting to flee into Mexico. The announcement rippled through the room, sealing the final chapter of the threat that had stalked us for years. Celine and Jace faced their consequences next. Celine cooperated with investigators, earning reduced charges, but she would still serve time for her role in the destruction and fraud. Jace, who had attempted to pin everything on her, faced harsher penalties after the recordings exposed his involvement in embezzlement. Their fall was absolute. Their ambitions ended in the ruins they had set for others. That evening, back in the greenhouse, something soft caught my eye behind the largest orchid pot. A small envelope, brittle at the edges. Inside was a note written in my father's unmistakable hand. If you found this atlas, it means you finally understand. Remember, anger clouds judgment. What I leave you is not a company, it is the ability to rise when everything else falls. Beneath the note was a thin file describing a clean energy project he had never disclosed. A design meant to give low-income communities access to affordable power. It was his quiet dream, unfinished yet full of potential. Reading it felt like discovering the real heart of who he had been all along. In the days that followed, I restructured Rowan Dynamics with that purpose at its core. We shifted a percentage of our research funding into community-driven tech. I created a grant for young engineers. I asked Ember to serve as vice president, the partnership between us finally restored. For the first time since my father's death, the company felt aligned with the man he wanted me to become. One evening, standing alone in the greenhouse, the setting sun filtering through rows of orchids, I realized something I hadn't been able to articulate until then. Celine, Jace, Marshall, none of them had truly threatened the foundation of what my father built. Because the foundation wasn't concrete or documents or patents. It was the conviction he instilled in me, the resilience he lived by, and the integrity he fought so fiercely to protect. Looking out over the Santa Cruz coastline, I felt the weight of everything finally lift. I had walked through betrayal, doubt, and danger, but I had made it to the other side unchanged in the ways that mattered and transformed in the ways my father hoped I would be. The revenge chapter had closed. What began instead was something far greater, a new life shaped not by what was taken from me but by what I chose to build.